I do hope that we see more things like Helium Mobile, where it is a genuinely useful and valuable product, regardless of the crypto part. And to some degree, the crypto part is abstracted away from the typical user, right? Like you could go get anyone to use Helium Mobile, and regardless of the crypto part, they're going to find it incredibly valuable with a good user experience and et cetera, et cetera. Crypto bit is just sort of icing on top and the way that we do our bookkeeping in the background, but really not so much of the user-facing product.
Before we get moving on today's episode, just a quick disclaimer. The views expressed on this podcast by either myself, my co-host, or any guests are their personal views and do not represent the views of any associated organization. Nothing in the episode should be construed or relied upon as financial, technical, tax, legal, or any other advice. Okay, let's jump into the episode. All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Lightspeed. We are joined today by Amir, one of the original founders of Helium and the current CEO of Nova Labs, who's building Helium Mobile. Amir, thanks a ton for hopping on today. You have a very rich history in the space, and so I'd love to just get if you can just walk us through your background of how you ultimately came into the space and what led you to building here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been, we've been a long time, honestly. It's been a long journey for us. Founded Helium in 2013 with Sean Fanning, who was the co-founder of Napster. Some of you may remember. Anyone old will remember. Before that, I was heavily involved in the video game industry. That's where I spent most of my prior life. Used to play video games at a professional level, so I was like a Quake and a Quake 3 world champion. And then worked on the sort of building side of games and did stuff like Battlefield 1942 and some other titles. Helium's mission was really always about building open and ubiquitous wireless networks, primarily focused on sensors at the start. Wasn't a crypto thing at all. Like I was very, very late to crypto, I'll admit. Obviously knew about Bitcoin and had heard about it all the way back from 2009. But I didn't understand it at all. I thought it sounded ridiculous. And in hindsight, I wish I'd spent more time, obviously, looking at it. But it wasn't really until like 2017 or so that Helium as a company really started to take crypto seriously as a way to kind of incentivize, but also unify like economics of like disparate people doing stuff, so we wanted to build this like big sort of global wireless network, and figuring out how to do that without some sort of, distributed ledger or similar was really challenging. And so I think the Filecoin white paper was probably the first eye opener for me really about how this could work. Because, you'd seen other, for example, file storage networks existed, but they still used things like proof of work, and never really made any sense to me to like have a sort of CPU hashing solution for a file storage network. And so Filecoin was the first time where I had seen something where the proof was like the thing that it was supposed to be doing. So making file storage available or making space available or proving that you were storing files or like some combination. I thought was amazing, and that was really sort of the initial genesis idea for us as to could we apply something like that to wireless network building. We came up with this concept called proof of coverage. We launched Helium in 2019, kind of took off from there. And now we're building Helium Mobile, which is sort of an evolution or an extension of the original concept, but really focused on mobile users and cell phones and those kinds of devices instead of IoT and sensors. So that's kind of I don't know how long that was, like a 3-minute version of a 11-year, 12-year journey. But yeah, it's been quite a ride.
That was great. And it might be helpful if we can expand a bit on like the IoT side of things and like why, like what was the pull of saying, all right, you know what, I think it'll be incredibly beneficial if we can cover the world in sensors. Like what was the pull there for you?
So if you can think back to 2012, you look kind of young, so maybe it was, I don't know how long ago that was for you or how in your mind, but in 2012, the concept of IoT or Internet of Things was really becoming a big idea. And the concept there was that, sensors should be like everywhere, like literally everywhere. They should be on food, they should be in agriculture, they should be used to measure radiation levels. The environment should know when wildfires start. There's like so many different ideas, and some of them were obvious and some of them were non-obvious. And really the challenge at that time was that there wasn't a wireless network designed for those kinds of devices. Like, you had to use cellular networks, and they were very expensive and very power hungry at the time. And so that felt like a huge gap and a huge opportunity at the time, which was like, if there's supposed to be like tens of billions of these sensors, they're going to need some way of connecting to the internet and some way of sending and receiving data. And that wasn't going to work either from a physics point of view in terms of battery life and coverage, or from an economic point of view. If you had to spend, $20, $30 a month, per sensor, that wasn't going to work either. So it felt like the least well-served, area of telecom. And that was super interesting. It was like a big opportunity. There was white space frequencies coming available and all this other stuff that we thought made it an interesting opportunity. And so that was kind of the genesis of it. We had a few friends that were building businesses that were sort of adjacent to that idea. We had one friend that was building what I would describe as like a Fitbit for babies, and another that was doing, people counting in like retail spaces, so like trying to provide sort of web analytics for the real world back then. And both of them had the same kind of problem. And so we're like, okay, maybe there's something to it, and maybe they can be our first customers. And that's kind of like what helped get it rolling, was that not only was it an interesting idea, but there was also kind of an immediate practical application, like sitting right in front of us in the form of friends of ours that were trying to solve this.
My friends, big news. Blockworks is hosting Permissionless 3 in Salt Lake City this year. So we're heading west for 3 days starting October 9th. Permissionless is our industry's premier DeFi event that brings together crypto natives from all over the globe. I've personally been the last 2 years and can honestly say that the attendees are incredible. It's people who actually care about crypto. We'll also have more than 200 industry titans speaking at the event, and this includes builders like Lucas Bruder from Jito Labs and Brian Pellegrino from Layer Zero, or investors like Kyle Samani and Joe McCann, and even elected officials like Representative Tom Emmer, who's fighting the good fight in Washington. And it's narrative season, so we're going to be covering the 7 hottest themes in crypto. This includes things like modularity and restaking, or Bitcoin and L2s, and even AI and crypto. The goal is to keep you up to speed on major developments in the industry. Ticket prices will be structurally increasing over time, so get your ticket today. For my Lightspeed family, I got you. We're going to use code Lightspeed10 in all caps, no space, for 10% off your ticket. All right, everyone. I look forward to seeing you at Permissionless 3, and let's get back to the show. And so if we keep following that line of thought there, then, we kind of fast forward to today's world where, we're trying to push more towards into the mobile network side of things. So what was the kind of the light bulb moment, if you will, for why pushing into mobile made sense, given the construction and the background of like working on Helium?
So a lot of stuff, I think for me, startups have always been the most interesting, or projects have always been the most interesting, when they are able to like capture something that couldn't really have happened prior. And in the mobile space, a few things had happened all at the same time that we thought made it possible to do things now that couldn't have been done before. So, for example, in the United States, where we are, a block of frequency that used to be owned by the Navy became unlicensed for the first time. It was called CBRS, the Citizens Band Radio Service. It became unlicensed. It used to be used for radar and a bunch of other stuff. And so they made that, the FCC made that available, I think, during the Trump administration. And then I think more important than that, like a bunch of phones started to support those frequencies, because one of the challenges with cell phone networks is that not only do you need some spectrum, you also need phones that support that spectrum, right? So it's no good if you have access to some frequencies, but like iPhones can't use it or something, right? It's like it's not going to be helpful. And so as we started to watch this evolve, we started to see iPhones start to support CBRS, and we saw that most modern Android phones were supporting CBRS. And then on top of that, you had guys like Facebook or Meta now had started to open source some of their cellular protocol technology. So there was a project called Magma that Facebook had been building, which again was like it was a cellular core that allows radios and phones to connect with each other. And again, that prior to that was a very expensive, complicated piece of software that had to be built yourself. And so it felt like there was this convergence of all this stuff, and obviously crypto was starting to take off, in 2021. So there was this convergence of like, okay, it can be done now and it couldn't have been done before. You've got mobile data consumption exploding at like a geometric rate. You've got CapEx spending on like wireless infrastructure slowing down, right? So you've got the big companies like AT&T and Verizon and guys like that slowing down their spending because it's so expensive. And you've got sort of population growth still happening. And so the population keeps growing, they keep consuming more data, but it's too expensive to build networks to support them. And so we thought that that was a very interesting, like, confluence of events. And now the technology was like open source and available and unlicensed in a way that we could actually go build a solution for that where we couldn't have in the past. So that was kind of the way we thought about it. The sort of cherry on top is that I think everyone absolutely hates their current service provider. Like I don't think in all my years of doing this that I've ever come across someone who's like, yeah, I love Verizon. Like that never happens, right? And so there's this built-in sort of distrust and hatred for the establishment that I think resonates closely with what crypto stands for to some degree. And so I always thought that was interesting too. That was just sort of a cherry on top kind of thing, because I can't think of that many industries that are that big where like literally everyone hates the providers in that space or the products. You know what I mean? Like people love Apple, but I don't know what the Apple is in the telecom space. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't seem like there is one.
It's funny how true that is. And one call with the customer service rep, and you'll be quickly refreshed why you feel the way you feel about that mobile carrier. Yeah, I recently just switched over my Wi-Fi carrier as well, and like brutal. Just never a good experience. You just hang up the phone more frustrated than you were going into it.
And then you get this other stuff that, I mean, like just recently came out that, and you saw that all the carriers got fined like $200 million or something for selling your location data without your permission. So there's always that kind of like they're doing something shady and you don't know what it is. And, there's just something about the structure there that people distrust. And I think that's a good opportunity.
So how do you think about like the established Web 2, like if you really could even call it that, but the established cellular carrier market today in the US? Like when I'm based in the US, so I think of Verizon, AT&T, and like maybe T-Mobile. Like what's your long-term vision for Helium Mobile? Is it to disrupt that and like be, number one or number two or number three? Or like how do you think about where Helium Mobile can end up in the long run?
I mean, I want to say that we could disrupt them, but I'm also a realist. Like it's one of those areas that has so many moats built around it that it's really hard for like someone like us to come in there, right? And so the biggest one is spectrum availability, right? And so if you're not in the wireless space, maybe you don't really understand how important this is, but whenever you want to send and receive something over the air, you have to have access to some spectrum or some radio frequency that you can use. When you're AT&T or T-Mobile or Verizon, like they own a lot of like what's called licensed spectrum. That means it's a block of frequency that like belongs to them. Like they bought it at an auction from the FCC. And when you own your own spectrum, you're allowed to transmit and receive at extremely high power levels, right? So you can have a cellular base station on a tower somewhere, and it might be able to go like tens of miles, right? Like you might be able to transmit and receive for that kind of distance, right? And when you're not a spectrum holder, when you're using in something like CBRS, so if you're in Wi-Fi frequencies like 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, you can operate there, but at much, much lower power levels. Like in some cases, 100th, in some cases, 1,000th of the power levels. There's all these other restrictions about what you can and can't do. And so it makes it very difficult. You're not on the same playing field by any means, right? Like we are, I think, doing an amazing job given the tools that we have. But in order for us to do what the big carriers do and sort of blanket the entire, country or cities with coverage is really, really hard when you don't own your own spectrum. So obviously our tactic is to try and make up for that in just pure volume, so like making devices cheap for people to install. Like you can buy a Helium Mobile hotspot for like $250 on the low end. Obviously doesn't create anywhere near the same kind of coverage area as a big outdoor, cell tower. But at the same time, like most of the data usage or most of the data consumption is happening indoors. It's almost 90% of data consumption actually happens indoors on cellular networks. And so that's an interesting opportunity, right? If you can get hotspots placed in the right spots, right? Like in retail areas and shopping malls and strip malls, like whatever, you can really start to capture a lot of traffic. So I think it just sort of depends what you think about. Like, are we going to cover the whole country? Like, no, you're probably never going to see, a Helium Mobile coverage map that looks like the big Verizon one with like red everywhere. Like unless we just made it up, pretty unlikely that will ever get to that point. Can you get to a place where like a significant amount of data uses the Helium network? Like, absolutely. I think it's absolutely possible. And so that's kind of what we're focused on. Some combination of like, how do we create a useful network, right? So it's not just about broad coverage areas, but coverage in specific places that matter a lot. And how do we sort of redefine what the customer experience is to some degree, right? Like, sort of to your point about how terrible it is dealing with support, and what I mentioned about like selling customer data. So with like Helium Mobile, for example, you can opt in to sell your location data, and then you earn tokens for that, right? You actually get paid for that work that you're providing. And so I think there's little things like that have the potential to like sort of flip the expectation on its head a little bit of what it means to be like a mobile customer. And so that's where we're focused. It's some combination of like the user experience and the customer experience, and sort of owning your own data. We have a lot of like very, I think, interesting features coming, whether they're about SIM swaps or like the sort of future of what we think phone numbers should look like, and things like that. That I think will make life a little bit better and more interesting, I think, as a user.
I definitely want to drill down on the SimSwap piece as well as the crypto side overall. But before we do that, let's go one step further on what you said in the first half of that conversation, which was the absence of owning your own spectrum. You're kind of forced into leveraging different pieces of equipment. So can you just talk to us a bit about, maybe for the viewer who's like unaware or unfamiliar with kind of what the Helium network is, like how the interplay between the Helium network and then Helium Mobile and how that kind of works?
Yeah, so the Helium network is sort of the community-owned, crypto-powered protocol that sort of provides the economic backbone for building these wireless networks, right? And so what that practically means is that anyone can buy what we call a hotspot. It's like a small, I don't know if I have one laying around. It's like a small, wireless access point looking device. You set it up. It's pretty easy. It's pretty straightforward. You use a phone app. You set it up much like any other consumer electronics device. And then once you've done that, what it means is that Helium Mobile subscribers, anytime they are near you, anytime they're close to your hotspot, will send and receive data to the internet through your hotspot instead of a cellular network. And when they do that, you earn tokens for that, or you get paid in mobile tokens based on how much data you transmit and receive. You also earn tokens for how much coverage you create, because you have to sort of solve this chicken egg problem a little bit, right? Like, you need a network to exist, but there's not going to be a network, but you're not going to have a network without users, and you can't have users without a network. And so one of the ways that I think crypto helps sort of grease that flywheel a little bit is by helping to reward people just for the start of building the network. And obviously we learned that from Bitcoin. Filecoin and others do this exactly the same thing, where like you are rewarded for the act of creating coverage, and then you're also rewarded when people use that coverage. So over time, the network will move much more to the using coverage model than the creating coverage model. But for now, it's sort of a little bit of a split. And so that's, to me, that alone is fascinating, right? Because the telecom space is not one of those industries where, like, if you were a normal person, you have any way of participating, right? And I think, not that anyone uses cash anymore, but I think of like ATMs as an example, right? Like, if you could buy ATMs and put them in, high traffic places and earn some money that way. I think Uber sort of opened up transportation as an option for people to earn money. I think Airbnb did the same thing with hospitality. But telecom has never been one of those, right? Like, it's always heavily gate kept, whether it's because of spectrum or equipment or licenses or regulatory or whatever it is. So Helium, to me, is really the first time that a normal person can say, "Hey, I want to operate a cell tower," and get in there and do it and participate in a very big multi-trillion-dollar universe.
And boosted coverage is this other piece of the puzzle here on like the incentivizing usership in a particular way that I think is pretty interesting. Can you walk us through that? I think you recently announced that Los Angeles is getting some boosted coverage as well.
Yeah, so one of the challenges with a decentralized, like, sort of permissionless protocol like Helium is that you can kind of put stuff anywhere, right? And when the IoT network was being built out, I think we were a little bit less worried about that because the goal of the IoT network really was broad, like global coverage, because there wasn't an existing network that you could otherwise use. But with the mobile network, I think you need to be a lot more precise, right? Like if you think about having a hotspot in your own house, for example, not really going to be particularly useful. You are likely to be the only user of it ever. And you could just be using your home Wi-Fi instead, right? And so what you really want to do is try and incentivize this, or devise a system that incentivizes the creation of coverage for other people, right? So it's not for you. It's really more about like, how do I get the maximum number of like disparate people to connect to this device? And so that usually is going to mean a retail, like a store or a restaurant or a pub or whatever, right? And so how do you sort of devise a system that promotes that? And one of the things that was proposed in the Helium community is this idea of boosted locations. And what that means is that a company that uses the Helium network, like us, can say, we think this area here is really, really valuable. If you put a hotspot here, you're going to earn 5 times, 10 times, 20 times, 100 times as much as you usually would if you put a hotspot here and sort of verify that it's there. And so that's kind of the idea. It's like, big carriers like a Verizon will spend an enormous amount of money on network planning, right? Which is the process of like figuring out where people are, where towers should go. And this is sort of the decentralized version of that to some degree. Like we as a company, we learn from the users using the network. So I mentioned that people can opt in to this process called discovery mapping, where you can say, hey, I'm willing to share my usage data and my location data in exchange for tokens. We then take that data and use that to inform what we do for boosted hexes. So we say, okay, there's a ton of people here, like an airport, or like some of the places are obvious, like airports, theme parks, whatever. Some are less obvious. But it's sort of this constant feedback cycle where we sort of learn from users. We also use things like census data and other stuff that is more obvious. And then we boost various locations based on some combination of all of that data. So up until very recently, it was mostly in Miami, which was our launch city. We just did a bunch in LA. That's sort of going to be an ongoing process where you're going to see new boosted locations show up all the time. There's actually a Twitter bot that will sort of announce them as they appear. I think we'll go to New York next, and we'll just sort of keep growing it that way. You can still deploy coverage wherever you want. It's just those are going to be the most lucrative locations, and it's a little bit of an experiment, right? We don't know. I don't know if anyone's tried network planning this way before, and so we will learn and see whether or not that incentive mechanism is like strong enough to like really get people to put hotspots in those places.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating example of using crypto and token structures to incentivize and bootstrap a network. It's really cool to see the crossover between the physical and digital world here as well. It's something that always gets talked about, but is really rare. And you guys have kind of been pioneering in this direction. Like, what are some of the learnings you've had in like how to use a token to like incentivize a very specific action? Like, how much thought goes into which action you need to incentivize? I know earlier you mentioned kind of the trade-offs or balancing between using the network and building the network. Like, how do you think about that on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, it's very challenging actually. It's because Helium and everything in crypto, honestly, is still so early. The speculative nature of all of this is still extreme, right? Like token prices go up and down by like tens of % a day, which is just ridiculous in any other market, except for GameStop, I suppose, and AMC. And so, I think the hardest part, if I were to think back now, we've been doing this in the crypto side of things for like 5 or 6 years now. Like one of the biggest mismatches is this sort of it's the duration mismatch, right? Like in crypto, a lot of people are short-term thinkers. They're in it for very short periods of time, just trying to make some money, and then they move on to the next thing. Whereas, the act of like network building is a multi-year or multi-decade, process, right? If you think about what it's really going to take to succeed. And so, making sure that all of that stays aligned somehow, I think is very challenging. And frankly, I'm not sure if we've exactly figured it out ourselves either. And you see it in a lot of projects, like people worry about, is Bitcoin going to be sustainable when the block subsidy keeps having like this? Is there going to be enough like transaction volume and fees? It's exactly the same problem, right? Like our miners just in it for the big block rewards right now. And once those block rewards go away, they're just going to say it's not worth it anymore. And then what happens to Bitcoin when that happens? And so everyone has the same kind of problem where you can't have infinite money supply or infinite token supply. And so you have to have like some kind of mechanism to reduce the token supply or cause it to have some scarcity. But at the same time, there has to be enough, incentive for everyone to want to participate. And then worst of all is that you've got wildly unrealistic expectations. Like people buy like a $200 or $300, $400 hotspot and get mad if it pays for itself in like 6 months. By any account, that's like an incredible investment. But the expectation in crypto is that, you're going to make millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars or whatever. And so that it's really difficult to balance expectation. Like it's difficult because we're not allowed to say what we might otherwise want to say. Like we don't always understand regulations. It's unclear, it's murky. And so you would sort of generally err on the side of caution. And so we don't have anyone talking about price on the Discord, for example. And then some people find that suspicious because they think, well, why are you not allowed to talk about, so it's just like there's so many things going on. But I would say it's that duration mismatch and the sort of unrealistic expectations of the crypto market in general do make it quite difficult to find a good balance. When you've got people buying like $1,000 worth of dog with hat or whatever, and it becomes worth $15 million, like people just have a detached version of like reality based on some of that stuff. And I think it does make it difficult.
Yeah, no. Roaring Kitty is back, and he is not helping our problems on the GME and GameStop side of things. But it's interesting. You mentioned Bitcoin there, and like there is that like fee imbalance, right, where miners do earn block rewards, both from this block subsidy being new BTC mined and issued into circulation, as well as like the fees side of things. And is that like something that makes sense over the long run for these hotspot miners to like earn some portion of like network fees that are accrued across the Helium network, or is it strictly just on like the token inflation side?
We hope over time that the majority of like earnings for hotspot operators come in the form of data that is paid for by someone else, right? So if you think about the structure, like if you had a hotspot in your house and a Helium Mobile subscriber stands outside your house and like watches Netflix, what's really happening is that we as a company are paying you, the hotspot host, indirectly, like through the subscriber, but someone is paying for that data at the end of the day. And in this case, it's subscriber pays us, we pay you. And so that's the hope, is that you want to try and like design a token structure, I think, or an economic system where as much of the value is derived from real demand versus speculation as possible. Because otherwise you're always tied to the market doing this, right? Like Bitcoin goes up 5%, altcoins go up X percent. Bitcoin goes down some percentage, all the rest of the tokens go down too. And that's problematic, right? And so you want to try and create a situation, I think, where as much of the value of the tokens is derived from real people paying for real things as possible. And right now it's challenging. You still see the majority of like venture capital money going into like infrastructure, for example. Like I genuinely thought L3s were a meme until like a couple of weeks ago. But genuinely there are L3s. I'm like, seriously, like, is anyone even using the L2s? Is anyone even using the L1s for the most part, right? I mean, there's only really a few of them that have significant usage.
Yeah, it'd be nice if we could like master building L2s and then refocus on L3s, given that Degen chain is an L3 built on Base, and it's been down, not producing blocks for 2 days now. So
yeah, that was honest. That's how I discovered that L3s weren't a meme. Was that there was actually a chain that was down, and so I think the crypto market's still very, very young and to some degree immature, right? And still overvaluing infrastructure versus like applications and products. I mean, you look at the top 10 or 15 like crypto market cap things, and they're all really some kind of infrastructure play in some way. Only really when you start to get to like the Uniswaps and renders and things like that do you really start to see, value being placed on the application side. And so, it's just going to take some time, but I do hope that we see more things like Helium Mobile, where it is a genuinely useful and valuable product, regardless of the crypto part. And to some degree, the crypto part is abstracted away from the typical user, right? Like you could go get anyone to use Helium Mobile, and regardless of the crypto part, they're going to find it incredibly valuable with a good user experience and et cetera, et cetera. And the crypto bit is just sort of icing on top and the way that we do our bookkeeping in the background, but really not so much of the user-facing product.
it makes sense to kind of push in that direction too over the long run. I mean, I feel like we'll have to abstract away a lot of the pieces of crypto, especially on the wallet side and the interacting with the blockchain side is like very clumsy, painful, friction-filled tasks. I tend to agree with you in that direction. And, you guys have a really compelling plan at $20 a month. Do you know, like, I'm curious, like, have run any like user analysis and like who these users are? Are they like, someone who maybe got like the Solana Saga phone and is like, all right, I got a second crypto phone. Like, let's give this thing a test. Like, I'm just curious if you've done any user segmentation analysis.
It mostly is crypto folks. I mean, certainly a bunch of Saga users, but really people either in the Helium community or adjacent to it. Like friends and family. And I think it's okay. Like we, despite what I just said about the crypto abstraction, like I do think it's important to focus on like a segment. There are so many MVNOs and MNOs, which is like telecom speak for carriers, I guess, and there's hundreds of them, right? Like, are you going to pick Boost versus Mint versus Verizon versus Cricket versus there's like so many, and they're all, I don't want to say misleading, but let's just say the marketing is like, it's difficult to discern from the marketing what the pricing really is. Like you'll see Mint come out there and say it's $15 a month, but it's really only $15 a month for the first like 3 months or whatever. And then it ramps up to some other number. And so I think it's difficult to just wade into a market that's that crowded and just go broadly, right? And so we are going to be very focused on crypto users and enthusiasts and people focused in the crypto space, just because it's a big market, but also allows us to focus our offering very precisely. So things like discovery mapping, the fact that you can now use mobile tokens to pay for your cell phone plan, we think is kind of an exciting thing. So you can actually earn tokens for mapping and then pay for your plan that way. You can also buy hardware that way. You can buy Pixel phones and hotspots using mobile tokens. And so, there are some very crypto specific things. We've got the SIM swap stuff, which we can talk about in a second. We've got some other interesting ideas and products in the work that are sort of crypto focused. And so we'll spend some time there. We're closing in on 100,000 subscribers, which still doesn't really scratch the surface of how big the crypto universe is. Like I think Coinbase has 90 odd million US based customers, for example. So that's a pretty big universe. And if we can even sort of put any kind of dent in it, that's a great way for us to start and get a foothold versus just trying to compete broadly with like any cell phone carrier, which I think is really, really tricky.
Yeah, I have one more crypto specific question, which is all right, so we've talked a bit about like why the crypto side is quite important, but how do you think about like where you were going to put your crypto infrastructure? Like why choose to build on Solana and just walk me through that decision process.
So when we launched Helium in 2019, we really started building in 2017, and back then, it was kind of Ethereum or nothing, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I think some other stuff was bubbling around there, like EOS maybe was in progress and stuff like that. But and Ethereum already seemed like it was going to be difficult to figure out how to use. Like we basically would have had to build an L2. And in hindsight, maybe that was the right thing to have done. Like we could very well have built an L2 and sort of interacted with Ethereum that way. But at the time, if you can remember back then, like the market was very, very focused on decentralization and sort of the purity of these protocols. And so we really wanted to focus in that direction. So we ended up building our own layer 1 blockchain that actually ran entirely on these little hotspot devices that people had in their homes, which is just a wild design decision in hindsight. But we really wanted it to be such that like this was the most decentralized version of a blockchain that you could have. And it really was. I mean, there was like 50, 60,000 nodes, and there were no validators or like central entities involved in any of that. And so it's sort of amazing. But as it started to scale, just became harder and harder to manage. Dealing with peer-to-peer connections on the internet was really, really hard when people are all behind firewalls or like some kind of NAT or like something on their home networks. And so we sort of kept adjusting and evolving, like added validators, for example, and just sort of kept going in that direction. But as that was happening, I think the market was improving. We had known the Solana guys for quite a long time, like Anatoly, the CEO, the founder there at Solana, had worked with our CTO back at Qualcomm. And so, we had known those guys. We actually tried to hire Anatoly before he started Solana. And, we had been close. We'd always been very close. but that, it wasn't ready at the time when we launched in 2019. Solana was just about launching as well, and you don't want to be a startup depending on another startup. I think if you can avoid it. But as that evolved, and as Helium evolved, there are just so many benefits to being attached to a bigger ecosystem and a bigger chain. Not only do you get all of their community excited about what you're doing, but you get very practical benefits like all the wallet support, exchange support, like all the DeFi protocols, like all of that stuff that you otherwise don't have when you're on your own island. And of course, it was a very controversial process to like pick a chain out of the 200 chains that were available. Like people were coming out like, why don't you use SafeMoon? I was like, I don't even know if that's a real thing, and people were like coming up with like chains that I'd never heard of, and like, why didn't you do this and why didn't you do that? And so very tribal. But we were focused very specifically on like, is it fast? Does it have a good DeFi ecosystem? Is it cheap enough? That was really one of the biggest concerns. Like, can we actually like transact the amount of transactions that you have on Helium? And what would the migration process look like? Like, one of the hardest things is like, you've got a bunch of users on chain one, you need them to end up on chain two, and you want to make that as seamless as possible. And one of the things that Solana had going for it was to use exactly the same elliptic curve cryptography that we did, which meant that we knew if you were address A on Helium that you would be address B on Solana without having to know your private key. So we could migrate the whole ledger without the user having to be involved in any way, because we were very scared of any kind of like, put your private key in here and we'll show you what the Ethereum version is or whatever, because it's just going to be rife with so many like phishing attacks and fraud and stuff like that. So we really wanted to make it very hands off. And I don't think there were many chains that fit that bill. Maybe Algorand, but it was really like Solana. I forget who else. There's like maybe only one other that we could have pulled it off that way on. And Solana was, as far as we were concerned, the best option there.
I actually didn't know the backstory there on the same elliptic curve. That's quite interesting, and I think that was a great move to kind of prioritize security and kind of probably a nice way to narrow down the basket of chains that exists as well. But all right, I'm excited to hear about your thesis around like SIM swaps and how you guys can maybe help prevent this in the future. Maybe if we can actually start with like walking through how SIM swaps are possible today, and then kind of going from there.
Yeah, so I'll just start at a very high level. Like what a SIM swap is when an attacker is able to swap your SIM card into their phone without you really knowing it or being able to do anything about it at the time. And then once they've done that, they have your phone number. And so anything attached to your, persona that depends on your phone number as identity, like a bank account or a two-factor authentication over SMS or whatever, becomes at risk, right? And because that person now has your phone number. Most of the way this is done is not a technical problem at all. It's like nearly always social engineering, right? It is me calling up, the AT&T customer support and pretending to be you, Dan Smith, and convincing the guy on the other end of the line, the guy or girl on the other end of the line, that I am you, and that you should perform this swap. Like that's nearly always how it works. And sometimes there's money involved. Like it's not uncommon for people to just be bribed, especially in the physical stores. Like people just go in with $500 and give it to someone, and they will sort of authenticate you as the wrong person. And so it's super dangerous, like unbelievably high risk problem, especially when you've still got a lot of institutions like living in the Stone Age when it comes to like authentication and security. So like with Chase, for example, like one of my bank accounts, two-factor auth is the only, SMS is the only two-factor auth method available, right? And so even if I wanted to use like some other like YubiKey or, some other system, like I can't, right? And so I'm stuck using SMS. And so the SIM swap vector is a real problem. And you see it in crypto all the time, especially, right, where people get SIM swapped and then someone gets access to their Coinbase account or whatever, and then it's kind of game over from there. And so one of the things that, I guess a couple of things that made us think that this was an interesting problem to solve. Like, first of all, I don't think this isn't going to be a thing that appeals to like to everyone, right? Like not many people even think they're like who cares? If you take my phone number, not really a big deal. So there's some sort of like small subset of people who this is going to appeal to, but I do think it's important. And we sort of realized somewhere in the process that we already have like a very good SIM swap mechanism in the form of private keys. So like every Helium Mobile subscriber, like it is a wallet and private key holder on Solana. And so we were like, well, why would we not require like private key authentication in order to like create the SIM swap, to allow people to like move the SIM from one device to another? Like we really have to trust that that's like secure, because we depend on it, everywhere else when it comes to tokens and money. So why don't we just do it that way? And so that's kind of what we've been working on. We called it Secure AF. And it is basically this mechanism or this system where if you want to move your SIM card to another device, you have to sign it with the private key, and the same private key that belongs to your Helium Mobile wallet, which is a Solana wallet. And so there's a bunch of implementation details and like a ton of thought that has to go into that process, because at the end of the day, you're still dealing with T-Mobile, who's our partner on the network side, and so we still have to create a layer of security between us and T-Mobile, right? So that you can't just bypass that and go straight to T-Mobile and ultimately skip the whole thing. So there's a lot of thought that's gone into it. It's not ready to go live yet by any means. We've been swamped with features and stuff that we've been building. But for me personally, I'm super interested in it. I've attempted to have been SIM swapped many times. I think almost anyone like that is even remotely prominent in the crypto space has probably had the same experience as me. And we just think it's a very interesting and clever like implementation of cryptography. Like most of the time we talk about crypto, we're talking about like meme coins and stuff, but this is actually like a real, like here's a very practical benefit to applying cryptography in real life beyond things that you might already use like iMessage or Signal or whatever. And so that's kind of how we're thinking about it. And now with eSIMs, which are, I think probably most people are aware, like most of the time now you're not even dealing with like a physical SIM card anymore. You're dealing with a chip inside a phone that can be reprogrammed. Makes it actually worse on the SIM swapping front, because you no longer even need a physical thing. Like you don't even need to go into a store or do anything. You can just convince someone to swap the SIM credentials from one phone to another. So it's going to be a big problem. Like I said, I think I am assuming that most people, especially outside of crypto, are not going to like be that conscious of it or really think it applies to them that much. But at the same time, for those that it does, I think it's going to be extremely valuable. And I hope that they become evangelists of Helium Mobile and really talk about it as a result.
Yeah, it's unfortunately one of those things that you just kind of look at and like, won't happen to me, not a big problem. And then the day it does happen to you, you realize that it was indeed a very big issue, and you probably wish you would have done something in retrospect. But it's hard to it's kind of that way for all of security. I feel like it's really hard to get people to care about security. And I don't think that's like a crypto specific thing. I think that's kind of just like a human nature thing. Maybe that's got something to do with everybody's desire to gamble, which we continuously see as a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think people don't value privacy and security very much on the internet at all, right? And it frustrates me. I wish it wasn't true, but I think you're exactly right. But hopefully, we can do some work and like make them care about it a little bit more.
What does the onboarding flow look like? Like, if every subscriber needs to have a wallet, is that using something like, I don't know, like a Phantom wallet and like integrating that, or do you guys offer a custom solution there?
We have a custom thing. So inside the Helium Mobile app, which on the face of it is just like a normal cell carrier app, right? It like allows you to manage your billing and your subscription, and you can add international roaming, or you can create group plans, or you can do whatever. But then it's also a wallet, and so we try to it's semi custodial. Like we try to make it easy. Like we didn't want we have another wallet that when we first launched Helium. And it's a disaster, like trying to get the average consumer to remember 12 or 24 words and really trying to get through to them the fact that like we don't know the words either, right? Like if you don't write down these 24 words, like no one else can help you. And the amount of like hotspots lost and like HNT lost, and the world is not ready for like self-custody yet, at least not in that form. And so, we did it under a normal auth system of like, username, password, two-factor auth. And so it's sort of semi-custodial that way, but it's also very easy and accessible for basically everyone. You can obviously still move your tokens out to like other wallets if you prefer more security or whatever you want. But we do think it's important that it's like easily accessible for people. And as soon as you go to that 12, 24 word step, you've lost like almost everyone you could interact with, because it's not only is it just annoying, it's just risky, right? You can't, no one really knows what to do with that, and it's very, very difficult to communicate that like it's gone forever if you lose it, and people just aren't used to that.
I love that approach. Like, to me, self-custody, like, crypto provides optionality in a lot of different ways. And one of those ways is self-custody. And it's great. It's fantastic. It is a huge human benefit to have this available, but it is not great for consumer applications. In fact, it's not even not great. It has a negative impact. It's terrible. So I love to hear that you guys are like really thinking about the UX side of things and how do we get people actually on chain and interacting with different products. So that is fantastic news to me. But Amir, my friend, this has been a fantastic conversation. Is there anything we missed today? Any closing thoughts we need to leave the audience with?
I mean, I don't think I could finish without shilling a little bit. So our website is hellohelium.com. Still think it's the cheapest unlimited plan nationwide. So please go and sign up if you haven't already. Hotspots are also available there for sale. It's a great opportunity, I think, to get in and really create some impact in both your community, but with your friends and family. And we love to see this grow and can appreciate all the help.
Well, fantastic. We'll put a link in the show notes to that website you mentioned, but appreciate you again for coming on, and thanks. It was a fantastic episode. Cheers.
Thanks, Dan.